So, this Tuesday in Texas, held in San Antonio on December 3rd, 1991, the kinda weird and odd one-off pay-per-view held by the World Wrestling Federation. I've noticed that some of my past videos make mention of this Tuesday in Texas, and I've never really explained the purpose of the show or gotten into the specifics of this pay-per-view. So let's take a look at this Tuesday in Texas, a one and done pay-per-view produced by the WWF in 1991. This Tuesday in Texas was presented on pay-per-view just 6 days after the 1991 Survivor Series, which is kind of insane when you consider that there would be absolutely no time to promote the show via weekly television. Remember, there were no live weekly WWF shows back in 1991, so all the promotion for this Tuesday in Texas would have to be presented via syndicated shows. You may think that this was crazy back then, but internally, the WWF saw this as a test run. Vince McMahon had never put a pay-per-view on a Tuesday before, and he wouldn't again until Taboo Tuesday way later in 2004. What is also noteworthy here is that the 1991 Survivor Series that happened 6 days prior was presented on a Wednesday night. Typically the Survivor Series would air on Thanksgiving, but the 1991 show aired on Thanksgiving Eve. So really, this Tuesday in Texas was an experimental show. The WWF wanted to see if they could promote the show via syndication. They wanted to see if a concentrated and targeted ad buying campaign could be successful in a short period of time. And they wanted to see if a Tuesday night pay-per-view buy rate would be as successful as their other typical pay-per-view numbers. Seeing as it took over a decade for Vince McMahon to once again greenlight a Tuesday night pay-per-view, you can tell that this Tuesday in Texas wasn't the success that the WWF hoped for. Bruce Pritchard talked about the name This Tuesday in Texas in his Something to Wrestle podcast, and he talked about how the name came to be. It may sound a little dumb when you first hear it, but Bruce made the point that the name had a sense of urgency to it. This Tuesday meant just that. It was happening in under a week, not next week, not in a few months. It was happening this Tuesday. Of course, it also happened in Texas, so the pay-per-view name gave you everything you needed to know while adding that sense of urgency, like this is happening this Tuesday in Texas. I never really did like the name, and while Bruce Pritchard's statements here may seem extremely obvious, it also makes a ton of sense thanks to how quickly the pay-per-view happened after the Survivor Series and the lack of deep promotion in the weeks prior. Normally there would have been a 3 or 4 month build for WWF pay-per-views, but this wasn't the case for this show. The main chunk of the promotion, including the announcement of matches, actually happened at the 1991 Survivor Series, kinda making this Tuesday in Texas a direct follow-up to the Survivor Series show. This also created a bit of annoyance for WWF fans who purchased the Survivor Series, as they were pretty much being told for a huge portion of the show that they'd need to buy this Tuesday in Texas in order to see what would happen next. There was a lot of promotion for the Randy Savage vs Jake Roberts match that would take place on the Tuesday pay-per-view, a match that really should have happened at the Survivor Series, but more on that later. Also, The Undertaker won the championship midway through the Survivor Series pay-per-view, a strategic placing on the card that allowed post-match interviews throughout the show to hype the Undertaker vs Hogan rematch at the Tuesday show. Honestly, the Survivor Series in 1991 felt like an advertisement for this Tuesday in Texas in a lot of ways, and it was also quite shameless. So with this in mind, we will have to visit the 1991 Survivor Series a few times in this video to gain a full understanding of this Tuesday in Texas. Also, I should mention that this show was never officially released on VHS after it aired. Entire matches and promos could be found on the WWF Supertape 1992, but the dedicated pay-per-view didn't get a dedicated VHS release. Supertape 92 then became one of the WWF's better selling compilation videos, but I remember this being hard to come by when I was younger. Supertapes were released by Silvervision in the UK, but finding this particular release seemed to be more difficult than others. When file sharing became big online, This Tuesday in Texas became easier to find thanks to people uploading their recorded versions from the live pay-per-view, and eventually the WWE released the show in its entirety on the WWE network. It seemed like the WWF was finished with this experiment days after it began. They didn't even bother giving it its own dedicated video release. Anyway, let's get into it then. Two main matches were promoted for This Tuesday in Texas at the Survivor Series: the return of the reinstated Macho Man Randy Savage versus Jake Roberts, and the Hogan vs Undertaker rematch. Survivor Series opened up with a video package showing Jake Roberts attacking Randy Savage. Now, keep in mind that Savage had also retired, in storyline anyway, due to losing his match against the Warrior at WrestleMania 7. Due to Savage getting bitten by this snake, Jack Tunney announces that the planned Savage vs Roberts match will not happen at the Survivor Series, but instead it will happen this Tuesday in Texas. The WWF never flat out said that Savage vs Roberts would happen at the Survivor Series, but they very much implied that it would. So this was one of the WWF's biggest ever bait and switches, all in the name of selling a second pay-per-view in a short period of time. Survivor Series did feature interviews with Savage and Roberts, but if you bought this show in hopes of seeing the actual match, then you would have been left disappointed. Just very quickly also, the This Tuesday in Texas match wasn't Savage's first match since WrestleMania 7. He was frequently working house shows before the Tuesday pay-per-view showdown. The Hogan vs Undertaker match, I've already covered this in a previous video, but briefly, The Undertaker won the WWF Championship due to interference from Ric Flair, leaving fans with a slightly bitter taste in their mouths. Want to see the Hulkster get revenge and win the belt back? Well, you can if you call your pay-per-view provider and pay for it. This wouldn't have been a problem if The Undertaker worked with Hogan at, say, the Royal Rumble, but the fact that the WWF were trying to get fans to part with their money so soon, with no promotion except turning Survivor Series into a huge commercial for This Tuesday in Texas, it just felt very opportunistic in a way. Anyway, all we need to know is Undertaker's win against Hogan was tainted at the Survivor Series, and Vince McMahon was hoping that the little Hulkamaniacs would pester their parents to buy another pay-per-view within the space of 6 days, just to see Hulk Hogan get his revenge. So let's look at This Tuesday in Texas then. This show had more dark matches than televised matches, with some of these dark matches looking pretty interesting. Notably, the Roddy Piper vs Ric Flair match would have been fun to see, and oddly, I'd have liked to have seen Jim Duggan and Sergeant Slaughter taking on Barry Horowitz and Louis Spicolli. Also notable here is Charles Wright working as Sir Charles before the Papa Shango gimmick, and the Harris brothers getting a tryout match before they were signed. In total, there were 9 dark matches, all taking place before the pay-per-view went on the air, and the main show presented just 5 matches. More shocking is that this pay-per-view ran for just over an hour and a half, but to be fair, This Tuesday in Texas wasn't a full-priced pay-per-view, it was half price. The show opens up with the same Undertaker and Paul Bearer promo we saw at the Survivor Series, with The Undertaker promising to bury Hulkamania this Tuesday in Texas. Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan run down the matches coming up, and our first match then is IC champion Bret Hart defending the gold against the Skinner Steve Keirn. Steve Keirn had been an accomplished tag team wrestler for years, working as one half of the Fabulous Ones during the 80s, and here he was with one of those WWF gimmicks that promised to send him into superstardom and beyond. Jokes aside, Steve Keirn was a good worker, and modern fans might not know that he helped get Florida Championship Wrestling off the ground as a trainer, the precursor to today's NXT. Anyway, this match is quite good, and it stands out as the match that had the best in-ring work rate, which shouldn't really be surprising. The Hitman gets the win with the sharpshooter and a solid opener, a fine example here of Bret's ability to have arguably the best match on the card through in-ring work and not needing to rely on gimmicks. Sean Mooney is interviewing Jake Roberts backstage, reminding Jake that snakes are banned from ringside during his match with Savage. Jake Roberts was so good on the mic, his delivery was always cold and unsettling. On the flip side, we see a Randy Savage interview with Gene Okerlund that was full of intensity and eccentrics, but it's equally as captivating. Their match starts off pretty hot as Savage strikes first during Jake's entrance, and we are off. Now, I'll admit that this match itself here was nothing to write home about, which is a shame considering we have Jake Roberts and Randy Savage in the ring here, but as a complete package with the pre and post match happenings, it all turns into a really entertaining part of this Tuesday in Texas. First of all, the crowd is red hot for this match. They are going nuts from start to end for the return of Randy Savage. The pair do a lot of brawling around the outside of the ring, but in the ring, things are slowed down quite a bit. Savage gets the win with the big elbow, but this wasn't the end. Driven by anger, Savage goes to use a ring bell on Roberts after the match, but when the referee takes it away from him, Jake hits Savage with his DDT. Another DDT follows, and Jake goes to get his snake from under the ring. This prompts Elizabeth to run to the ring and try to reason with Jake Roberts, but Jake just drops another DDT as the Macho Man gets totally decimated before our very eyes. Roberts plays the part so well. He is mocking and screaming at Liz and Savage, and the ultimate heel move happens when Jake does the unthinkable. He slaps Miss Elizabeth across the face. A post-match interview is next, and Jake is delighted with how things turned out, while Savage, later in the evening, is seen losing his mind over what happened to Elizabeth. A really good Randy Savage promo here that lets us see a different side to his on-screen character. The WWF used Savage vs Roberts to try and sell an experimental pay-per-view, and no matter how questionable their tactics were, no one can say that the full story of Roberts vs Savage didn't deliver on this show. Just with this Savage match and the opening Bret Hart showdown, this Tuesday in Texas, I feel, was already better than the Survivor Series. But don't get too excited just yet. The next match pitting the Warlord against Davey Boy Smith, well, it's alright. It's not bad, but it's not really good either. This is the Warlord's final pay-per-view singles match. He did appear in the 1992 Royal Rumble, but when it comes to regular matches, this was his last outing. The problem with this match is that people were still trying to compose themselves after seeing that Savage vs Roberts stuff moments earlier, so Davey Boy and the Warlord didn't really have much of a chance here. The two did have good chemistry. They had mixed it up previously at WrestleMania 7 and in a SummerSlam tag match, but when comparing to what we had just seen, the match just doesn't stand out, I'm afraid. Bulldog gets the win at around the 13-minute mark. Next up, Ted DiBiase and the Repo Man take on Virgil and El Matador, and honestly, this one is pretty fun. It kind of encapsulates this era of the WWF, the wacky characters involved, DiBiase feuding with Virgil. It just reeks of early 90s WWF, and I love it. Watching this back too reminded me of how good Ted DiBiase was. The guy doesn't get much credit for his in-ring work, but his punches look really believable. He bumps around the ring like a champ, and he works like a heel from bell to bell. DiBiase and the Repo Man get the win here in a quite fun palate cleanser. We have our big main event next. You guys know what happens here, but before we get to this match, the Hulkster had an interview with Mean Gene Okerlund. Hogan writes off Survivor Series here. That didn't mean anything. It's all about this Tuesday in Texas. With Undertaker in the ring, the crowd gives Hogan a thunderous ovation as he walks down the entranceway. I always liked watching these old Hogan entrances from this era. The music and the crowd response just mixes so well. It's always a great entrance to watch. The match starts off with Paul Bearer and The Undertaker laying boots into Hogan, but Hogan quickly gets Paul out of the ring and our match begins. Now, we have to be honest here, both Hulk Hogan and The Undertaker had a certain routine to their respective wrestling styles back then. Undertaker would be hard to damage and Hogan would start strong, take a ton of punishment, and then he would Hulk up and magically score a win. This match is really no different, I'm afraid, but that doesn't mean it's a bad match. It isn't. Jack Tunney was placed at ringside to ensure no interference would happen. He didn't want a repeat of the Survivor Series, but of course there was interference. The match totally breaks down at the end with Ric Flair and Paul Bearer getting involved. The climax came when Paul Bearer accidentally hit Undertaker with the urn, allowing Hogan to throw ashes from the urn in The Undertaker's eyes to get a pinfall win. The win wouldn't stand in the end. Jack Tunney saw the ashes getting thrown in the Undertaker's eyes, and so the belt was put up for grabs in the 1992 Royal Rumble match. So you can see what the World Wrestling Federation did here. They sold this pay-per-view on the promise that Hogan would regain the title, and in a way, he did. At least the show ended with Hogan as champion, but this, as we know, didn't last long. So how did this Tuesday in Texas do in terms of buy rates? Tracking these old shows with accuracy is difficult, especially a one-off pay-per-view like this, but most reputable websites and sources claim that this Tuesday in Texas brought in a relative buy rate of 1.02, well under half of what the Survivor Series brought in. The next WWF pay-per-view, the 1992 Royal Rumble, also nearly doubled the buy rate of this Tuesday in Texas, so you can see why the WWF didn't bother with another Tuesday-based pay-per-view for over a decade. The show did have some ups and downs, but I think overall this is a fun watch, and again, I think it was much better than the Survivor Series. As a precursor to the Royal Rumble in 1992, one of my favourite pay-per-views and favourite Rumble matches, this Tuesday in Texas serves a much greater purpose than the Survivor Series. I recommend checking it out if you haven't done so already, even if the whole idea behind the show was a little ill-conceived.